Hello, welcome to Let's Talk Hiring, another edition. We are super excited to have Anna Taylor here from Semperis. For those of you who are listening to the Speed to Hire podcast, Anna is not a stranger. We've had conversations with her in the past and enjoyed it so much we wanted her back, and she was kind enough to provide us that time. So, Anna, really appreciate that. We're going to jump into introductions here in a second, but before we do that, as we're doing those, let us know from where you're tuning in from. So we'll put those in the chat and we can check on that. And then, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Anna. Can you give us a little background, really quick background on yourself, some context for those that are viewing, and then we can jump into our topic today.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me back again. I'm Anna Taylor, and I'm the Director of Global Talent Acquisition for Semperis. Semperis is a Series C cybersecurity software vendor, and I've been with the company for about 3.5 years now with a small TA team. And I'm based in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Wow. Probably get lots of invites in this up until now. Then it starts to get hot. Well, outstanding. Well, so a couple of things. So we've been talking about this collaboration topic for quite a while, but actually we were recently at SHRM Talent, and one of the things that we asked folks that were stopping by our booth was just some core challenges that we had, and we gave each of them a sticker, and in these conversations. And I guess we weren't really surprised by this, but it was overwhelmingly around collaboration with hiring managers, as you can see by the number of stickers in the lower right-hand corner. So that sparked further pursuit of that and kind of getting under the hood. And Anna has a ton of experience there, so we're excited to have her there. But before we dive in, we're also going to just want your feedback here real quick. So I pop up a poll here real quick that we ran earlier on LinkedIn, but would love your perspective here. So primary challenges you're experiencing as it relates to less than collaborative hiring process. You can put a number or just the piece itself. Number one, delays in communication. Number two, increased risk of bias. Three, ineffective interview process. Four, negative candidate experience. And five, more work created for me. So what, just you can just jump in there and we can talk through that. But as we get some answers in here, Anna, would love your perspective. Which one of these jumps out for you?
Yeah, as you were reading through those, I was almost going to say, I think we missed putting all of the above on there as an option, but I think I'm ranking myself here with like maybe a 3, 4, 5 is one of those has to be my top.
Yeah, interesting. The more work created for me is almost that all of the above, right? It's just like you really have to do that.
Yeah, I put this on my LinkedIn. I saw a lot of number ones, delays in communication. But of course, number 5 is, I think, Gary, you've used this quote before, which is you get what you subsidize, right? And so a lot of times when you have that poor collaboration with hiring managers and you step into that void to do the work, you've somewhat set the expectation for the next time you're working with that hiring manager that you will step into that void and subsidize the work. And so it's kind of this vicious cycle you can find yourself in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, so as we work through this, let's talk about, obviously these are all results of things that we're experiencing on the ground. So maybe we kind of tear down, like what do we see in a process? What are the contributing factors? A lot of times, we talk about in anything we're trying to solve, it's like mostly we reflect on the symptoms, but we have to go back to what's created the symptom in the first place, which is really closer to the problem. So Anna, in your experience, like where does that start? Where do we start to see this collaboration issue really start to come to bear?
Yeah, I really feel like the collaboration issue can come to bear even when you're not directly working with that hiring manager, right? So a lot of what I think I want to try and get across today to the teams here is to make sure that you have a really active relationship with the hiring managers, whether you're actually recruiting for them or not, right? Because then once you already have developed that trust and that connection and relationship, once you get into your recruiting cycle, you'll already have set such a good tone, for how you're going to work together. You're not starting from scratch. You're not, digging your way out of maybe a relationship that was contentious or negative in the beginning. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit, but I really think that it's the work you do outside of the actual search that is going to contribute best to, a successful collaboration once you're really in it.
Yeah. Related to that, on a curious your experience where, hiring managers, we have varying degrees of their own hiring experience. We have varying degrees of how often they hire, whether in the past or at our existing company.
Mhm.
As you think about building that relationship, it's kind of a spectrum, right? You've got some who you're probably working with a lot because the nature of the roles for which you're hiring, they're just, you're with them a lot, or maybe their team is growing rapidly. And in other cases, you may work with them once over a 2 or 3 year period because it's a smaller team or it's more stable, or maybe it's not growing. So how do you work inside that spectrum?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, there are definitely hiring managers who are, it's kind of twofold what you asked, right? Like who are more experienced. So for those, you can sort of jump right in. You expect them already to know the basics of what not to ask, what to do when they have a candidate ask them a certain question and things like that. And then there are others where the recruiters do have to do a little bit more hand-holding and training, right? But again, kind of it all comes down to if you have a really good outside of search, process and relationship built up with those people already, you should hopefully know what level you're playing with once you get into the search, right? And then you can sort through a lot of that in the intake call. It sounded like also one of your other questions was kind of, how do I maintain that with a hiring manager who I maybe engage with only once or twice per year versus the one that I see every week because they have like evergreen, obviously engineering. I bet any recruiters on the webinar today are probably tons of engineering recruiting. That just happens all the time for most tech companies, right? So
Yeah.
You're very connected with your engineering recruiters, but your engineering hiring managers, but maybe other departments like customer success or, more G&A, you're seeing some of these hiring managers once, twice a year. It's little check-ins. Like just this morning, I actually, texted on Teams one of my hiring managers because I had just helped him build a team just to say, hey, how's Carlos doing? How's that going? Because I was just curious. I said, how's it going? Did what we do, did it end up successful? And little touch points, of that relationship outside of the search is what I try to have my team maintain.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely important to maintain that relationship, but also there's an element of rust too. Like you said, there's going to be hiring managers with varying levels of experience. And maybe there was somebody that was doing a lot of hiring, so they got pretty experienced, but that was 12 months ago. And then, hiring slowed for their team and now they have to pick it back up again. You might expect them to be where they've been 12 months ago, but the reality is they haven't had any reps in 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to really, like you said, during the intake, kind of get a sense of where they're at. One of the things I think would be interesting to discuss is your take on the importance of hiring managers and their participation in the process, specifically from the angle, and this is really twofold. One is a lot of companies are facing this right now, or their HR or their TA team is being asked to do more with less resources, and therefore they have a reliance on hiring managers to help, fill in some of the blanks within the hiring process and pick up some of the slack. From your perspective, though, and from our previous conversation at Semperis, you guys were tasked with doing just a ton of hiring after raising, I think it was a Series D funding. And so I'm sure that created some pressure and a requirement for the hiring managers to be involved. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of that?
Yeah, so I think you're asking like the hiring manager's relationship, right? And the importance that kind of the recruiting team places on their responsibilities in the search. I do think that it has to be a standard, it has to be also scalable, the standard that you create. So in my opinion, for my team, what we established during that kind of period of chaos, it was 2022, but, it really hasn't, slowed down very much since then, was that we established that we have this kind of skeletal framework, right? That just, this is what it looks like. The recruiter is always going to be on video for X number of minutes, depending on the location, the region, the team. And then we're going to try and limit it to 3, maybe 4 interviews tops with your professional interviewing team. These are the questions that we're going to ask you right out the gate, so that we're all on the same page. So we tried to have, and we try always to have, a very kind of brief and simple to follow process where we know what our responsibility in it is. And then we're very clear with the hiring managers as to what we expect from them, right? And what we mainly expect from them is to just clearly articulate your need. And then after that, to be available. I think that there's a lot of recruiters that struggle with hiring managers who will say like, oh, I have no time. I can only interview like once this week. If it's not a priority for you, how can it be a priority for me? right? I'm hiring for you. So we're very clear and open about that. Hopefully that kind of answers your question, right? So I think that that's the most important thing, is to be really clear up front with like, this is the framework and like, this is what we're going to do as a recruiting team. And then as the hiring managers, like, this is going to be your part and I'm going to help you through it. But that's like what my expectation of you.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny. It's so counterintuitive, but it's what I heard at Sherm Talent when we flashed that image up at the beginning of this live stream, when everybody was saying their biggest challenge was collaborating with hiring managers. And the number one thing they said is hiring managers are just always saying, I don't have time. And that's in terms of getting interview feedback or just meeting with the recruiter to do an intake. I don't have time. And it's so counterintuitive, because at the end of the day, you're trying to help the hiring manager hire for a position for their team that's going to have a direct impact on their success. So from your perspective and in working with hiring managers, how do you flip that mindset? How do you get them to be thinking about it from that perspective of being super invested in the process? Because ultimately this person's going to have the biggest impact on me, the hiring manager.
Yeah, I mean, we try to flush that out in the intake step. It is really important. And then there are some hiring managers that you sort of have to like drag them along the process with you. It totally happens. Here at Semperis, it actually happens pretty rarely. You know, our hiring managers, I think, are also like really committed to the recruiting process and to having that kind of recruitment mindset. Sometimes it comes from top down, right? If that team lead isn't getting pressure from their department head to fill the vacancy, then maybe they don't, really care that much about filling the vacancy really urgently. So there's so many different areas in the ecosystem that it can go wrong if you don't have everyone holding each other accountable.
Yeah, that top-down thing is huge. I know from experience, a previous company at which I worked, part of, especially if it was a critical position, part of your OKRs for the quarter were getting that position filled. And it was your responsibility to do it, not recruiting's responsibility. And they were great partners for us. But if you had it, the recruiting team did a great job up front of walking through, like, let's be realistic about what this timeline is going to look like, so that you realize that a 13-week quarter is actually not very long when you're trying to hire for a critical position. And if your OKR is set for that, I'm like, every day counts. So, and you both mentioned actually a few times this intake concept, right? Which I think a lot of people take for granted. But Anna, it'd be great to hear from you. Like, what does that look like? It sounds like it's foundational. It's expectation setting. It's understanding the role. It's being able to communicate the process. Right. How has that evolved for you over the last few years? And what would you pass on as a recommendation for that?
Yeah, I think actually the thing that has evolved for us in the intake step is actually it has become more standardized. So in the beginning, it was, again, like we were so busy and we had so many roles that I would often, I have experienced recruiters on my team. So I really would let them kind of like run it how they wanted to. And I still let them run the intake meeting how they want to. But what we ended up realizing was we were asking a lot of the same questions. We're doing things similarly. So we kind of came together, I think it was about a year ago or so, brainstormed and created actually like an intake question document, which I know a lot of companies have, but we are still very startup-y, right? So we created that intake document that has a whole list of all the suggested questions that you should be going through and should be getting responses on, so that you completely understand the profile and that you've completely set the scene for the hiring manager. And we give that to the hiring manager in advance. So, one thing that is going to really weaken your intake process is if you surprise the hiring manager on that call, right? So like, one thing about our hiring managers is they are very busy. You have to find time with them, and then they have to find time for interviewing, right? So every minute that you spend with them and ask them for their time so that we can successfully recruit, you want it to be as efficient as possible. So by sharing those questions in advance, you're going to really set them up for success, because hopefully you have a really responsible hiring manager on the other side of this who is going to review those questions and like be prepared for you. And you're not like figuring out the profile together on the call.
Yep, absolutely. And then, so as you're walking through the profile, that's another aspect as well, is everything is about the job description. Do you have a process for how you, get beyond just the typical requirements to what is it we're really trying to accomplish here, and what is critical to success, not just today, but 6, 12, 24 months from now in that role? I'm sure that back to the point of experienced managers, some of those who are experienced have been through it and realize, yeah, I didn't do that very well the first time. Those that are less experienced may have not been through that yet. So how do you gently get to the right answer there?
Yeah, great question. So I do think, a lot of our questions, I mentioned this on the podcast with Josh, like we talked a little bit about Lou Adler's performance-based hiring model, right? And I think a lot of the questions are almost me trying to educate, or my team trying to educate the hiring manager on thinking that way. So performance-based hiring, in terms of, a major question we ask is, if I find you this perfect person, right? You're listing me these skills, you're telling me these requirements on the job description and the title that you want. If I find this person, what have they accomplished for you in 6 months? Or, in 1 year when you're doing their annual performance review, what are you hoping you're discussing? And, what goals are you setting for them and how are you measuring them? So I'm asking them about the actual day-to-day of the job. I'm not just reviewing the list of skills on the JD. And another thing, which I don't know if all companies do it this way, but this is how we do it. We don't post the job description until the intake call is done and we feel 100% confident about it. So often the hiring managers actually will submit a rec request to us. They'll have kind of a skeletal, job description on there. And then the recruiter and the hiring manager work through that job description and all these intake questions to really refine it and make sure that we're happy with, what's actually going to get posted and be candidate facing. So I don't know, again, I haven't worked in huge organizations, but I think in startups, that's typically how it's done as well.
Well, I think it's helpful because, as Josh was saying earlier before we started, many of the customers that we serve are, small to medium-sized businesses that are professional services, that are the culture fit. The people are critical to that. And sometimes the classic case of, we're so busy working in the process, we don't slow down to work on the process to make the process better. And I think sometimes those intake processes, to your point of not just pushing a rec live because you got it approved by finance, but actually almost having that intake process as a definition of done. Like it doesn't go live until we've got all parties agreeing on what it is we're looking for and the details around that, how we're going to hire that person, who's going to be involved. Yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah, in some ways. Sorry, go ahead, Anna.
I was just going to say, I think also your time to hire, right? Recruiters on the call, like think about your time to hire. If you rush to posting that ad and you tell the team or you tell finance, like, okay, I posted it, we're going to start working on it, but you didn't even have the intake call yet, you're actually hurting, your metric.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, in some ways, like you just said, you have to protect your process and the metrics that you're aiming to achieve, but you're also protecting the hiring manager, ultimately so they get the best outcome. I think there's this inclination that I have this open role, I got it approved by finance, push it live, let's start getting candidates and we'll figure everything else out later. But that doesn't actually end up speeding anything up, because the reality of what happens is you start getting candidates, then you don't know what to do with them. So then it takes you longer to review the resumes in the first place. Then you get to the interview or screening phases. You don't know what questions you're asking. You have to align on that. So it actually drags it out further than like just taking the day to iron things out before the process starts so we can run the rest of the process more smoothly. I love to, I know we're talking about the intake and this is great. And, I definitely want to get into some of the questions that you ask, and you hinted at some of them from Lou Adler's framework as well. But I want to back up a little bit. So we're talking about the intake, which is really the start of your collaboration with the hiring manager in a process. You alluded to earlier in this conversation, though, the importance of building relationships and connecting with hiring managers outside of the process, because that builds the foundation for running a good process. So whether it's thinking back to your time at the beginning of Semperis, or if you're just, giving a hypothetical example for people on the call, like think about starting in an organization, you're brand new, or you have a bunch of brand new hiring managers. Like, what do you do? Where do you start?
Yeah, so for me, where I started with Semperis was kind of an intro, right? So I took the first maybe 30, 45 days and I put time on people's calendars. I just like showed up on their calendars, right? They didn't know who I was yet, but I explained to them, I was brought here. I'm a new director of TA. This is kind of what I want to accomplish. I had a few questions that I, asked them. Most of them were very high level, just kind of tell me a little bit about your team, tell me a little bit about your background. And I wanted to understand the structure, how many people report to you, like very simple kind of like basic questions. And I made a little introduction to them. And I said, thank you so much for sharing that information with me. This is super helpful. And I love using like OneNote, for example, for my note taker and stuff like that. So every department has a tab, and I think have the notes from those meetings, that little roadshow I did. And that just kind of set the scene, and I think any good leader, recruiting or otherwise, right? Any good leader, when you come into a new company, that's really what you're doing. You're trying to evaluate, what's already there. Who do I need to meet? Who are the key players? And getting to know everybody before you start to, insert any changes or decisions or like what you were actually hired to do.
Yep. That's great. And in terms of decisions and the things and changes you want to make as part of coming into a new role, where do you start with that in terms of getting buy-in? It's probably not at, hey, I'm going to change the process and I'm going to first tell a hiring manager about it when they're ready to hire for a role, because as we just talked about, they're anxious about hiring for that role. And that might actually give you pushback if you're trying to like force that on them at that moment in time. So when you have these changes, what's the rollout like? Like, do you do presentations? Are you meeting with certain champions throughout the organization? How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, first I usually put something together that, whether it's a basic presentation with like PowerPoints or some kind of documentation. And I like to talk to people live. I of course, we like to communicate via email and Teams and, chat and use all the electronics, but speaking to people, live one-on-one is the best method I've always found for many things. And so before I rolled it all out, what I finally kind of decided to do, it went through many iterations. So I had, some members of the HR team that I was able to bounce ideas off of, and they like gave me feedback and we kind of brainstormed together. And then there were like one or two hiring managers that I felt more comfortable with, who like I kind of got their input too before I rolled it out to the wider team. And then what you said is exactly what I did, right? I booked a few times. We're an international company, so I gave people like a few time options so that people could adjust their schedules to join. And over the course of about 2 weeks, with maybe like 4 sessions I think I had scheduled, I had meetings with the hiring managers. I told them that if we are hiring for you this year, you are required to attend one of the 4 sessions so that I will hire for you. And so obviously that put a little pressure on everyone to attend. And we just went through it. We went through the deck. I let them ask their questions, and we set the tone for the year. And that was in 2022.
And did you have maybe there were some hiring managers where there's some pushback on the new processes or the change?
It's a good question. Like, there were definitely a few hiring managers that I had to go through it with them a few extra times, more like one-on-one, and they had maybe a lot of questions. Some people like to get into the weeds, or some people have a lot of questions. They really want to know specifics. Some hiring managers actually were very even agency, like agency friendly. Like, they really wanted me to just use agencies rather than like try my process first and stuff. So there were a few things to work through. But for the most part, we were in this huge, exciting stage of growth. And so I think that the hiring managers were just happy to have someone help guide them through it.
Yeah. And a partner, right? I think the key point you made there was you took the time with the people that needed more information or wanted to get into the weeds and the details of the process. You took the time, and that shows that you care, and it shows that you care about their success.
Yes.
And I think that goes a long way in helping to build a relationship before you actually have to work with them on an actual position. Gary, did you want to talk anything more about that before I wanted to hop back over to the intake and kind of get into some of the questions that should be asked during that process?
I was going to ask actually, and probably makes sense to do the intake first, but once you get into the process itself, let's talk through, how do we navigate a difficult hiring manager? Like, how do we bring them into the process? But we'll hold that until we get through this part of it.
I can't wait.
So, all right. So we talked about the intake. It's a requirement for you guys before the job can even go live to meet with the hiring manager. You referenced a few questions that you would be asking related to, what this person's future performance would look like. What are some of the other questions you're asking to uncover and help the hiring manager realize what they actually need and what they're looking for?
Yeah, so sometimes I'll also ask the hiring manager about their team, right? Even though I might know their team already and maybe I've hired with them before, I'll ask them some questions in real time about, let's say there's one person on your team, like, who would you want to clone? Think about this title. We hire a lot of solution architects. We hire a lot of software engineers. Like, often you are repeating the same profile. So at that time of search, I'll ask, who on your team right now do you just wish that we could just find another one of them, and that also gives us a lot of insight, because we can look back on how that interview process went. We can look back at that person's profile, what questions were we asking then? Is something different now? And it's interesting to see how sometimes those can change. Like maybe in January that they wanted this person, and now in June they're like, oh wait, but you hired me this person in March, and like now I want to clone that person, So it can happen sometimes. That can give you a lot of insight. And then one of the other questions that I also really like to ask too is like, what's kind of the career trajectory that you expect this person to be able to fall into as well, right? And that kind of aligns with the performance questions that I ask, where what are you expecting from them at 6 months? What are you expecting them for 1 year? But that's actually a candidate-friendly question. I want to be able to answer the candidate's questions in the interview process as to, the expectation the hiring manager has for like growth in the role and things, because that's been super common lately. I don't know if all recruiters are experiencing that over the last few months, but I'm getting asked a lot lately, like, what's the growth? What's the professional development? So I think it's important to understand from hiring managers how promotion prone they are, if that makes sense. Like, do they like to like build up their team? Are they planning to get a team lead maybe someday soon, where like if I find them the right person, that person can get an internal promotion, just understand more about the structure of the team and like the style of leader that they are.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you also hit on an important point about, the type of person or the type of candidate they're looking for could change. Like 6 months ago, they wanted to clone person A, but 6 months later, now they want to clone person B because things within the business have changed, or things within their team have changed, or the market. And now there's new dynamics at play. And so maybe person B is now, the person they'd rather clone than person A. And so I think a lot of times you mentioned, companies are hiring for the same role over and over again, or, at certain points throughout the year, a solution architect, let's say you're hiring every 6 months or whatever it is. It's very easy to just defer back to the kickoff we did. And it's like, all right, let's skip. We're going to hire for the same thing, same role, same job ad. Let's go. But that's why it's like, no, reset. Like, it's been 6 months. Things have definitely changed within the business and within the market. Let's make sure we're still aligned on what we actually need for your team.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Actually, Gary is a CRO, right? So like you said something earlier too, sales, I think sometimes that happens in the sales profile. That's where I've seen that attitude from a hiring manager most often, right? Is that they think, well, it's just the same sales profile that we always hire every single time. Like, this is our uniform, like, sales profile. But you should revisit it, every few months, like just kind of check in. Like, is this still what we're seeing is successful? Whereas on engineering and some other technical roles, there are little nuances, but I've seen it a lot in sales. I don't know if you have, Gary, but I see it a lot in sales.
Yes. So when you mentioned that, I was going to say you actually laced in there quietly, but it was a big one about, and what's changed, what's different. I'm like, that's really the issue. Is it is a great place I've found to start the conversation, but then just asking the questions of why. What was it? Is it the environment? Was it the training? Is it circumstance? Is it the time period that they just happen to be working in? Is it the book of business that they were getting? Because whatever person we bring in, we're pretty sure we're not going to replicate all of those variables, right? It is going to be. So which one of those actually contributed to success? And those are really much more difficult questions to answer. So I'm sure that all goes back to that intake process, which is, let's let you start there, but then really go into what contributed to that success. And then, Josh, is maybe where you're going next, which is, and then how do you prioritize those contributors?
Exactly. I think realistically, when you're looking at your team, there might be one person. Yes, if we can clone them, 10 times over, the team would be in a very good place. But I imagine also a lot of managers look at their team and say, if I could have these 3 traits or competencies from this person, plus these 2 from this person, plus these 5 from this person, that's like the perfect candidate. And so they come to you with all these things that they need. And then the reality is, it's like, all right, I don't know if we're going to be able to find that person. Maybe we will, but let's prioritize these things, because you've given me a list of 10 things. If we find somebody with 7 of these, is that still a really good candidate? If we find somebody that's really good with 3 or 4 of these things and maybe okay with these other 3 or 4, is that still a good candidate? So how do you help a hiring manager prioritize, and how do you calibrate with them on what good looks like, and ensuring that they're not just giving you a laundry list of things and it's like, find me this unicorn that doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you said that, because there's so many different variables there, right? I mean, if you have a hiring manager who does say things like that, who I want to clone this person, or I want these traits, and these traits all together in one person, at least they're actually giving you something pretty concrete, right? So like, let's give them a pat on the back for that. But at the same time, you do have to, in your conversation, like you said, prioritize, right? So like, that's just asking more questions. So, what are the initial projects you're going to have this person on? And then kind of through that discussion, you can see like, okay, so these 3 skills over here are really going to be the initially most important. And then what skills can you teach? We always ask that as well. So Semperis has a very specific product set and kind of tool that we look for and skill that we look for. But what area of that can you teach? So if I can find you someone with that, amazing. But can you teach them how to do, XYZ thing? So that's, I think, a really important conversation. And it almost does make it more of a strategic partnership conversation, right? Because you're kind of also like encouraging the manager to think about how they as a mentor and coach can, build their team and build upon the skills. So it becomes like a wider conversation. But that's how I would prioritize, like what things are deal breakers that you expect somebody to just come in and know. And then what things that, like, if they maybe have touched it before, you can, help them expand on their knowledge.
Yeah, and related to that, we got a comment. I'll show it here from, and forgive me if it's Lakesh, around this failure to plan. And we're bantering in the chat about, a failure to plan is a plan to fail, but resetting those expectations right up front. I thought that was captured that pretty well.
Yeah.
Gary, you always have the best, punchiest quotes.
I know, I'm full of them. It's like, it must be the coaching, the coach in me or something.
All right. Well, Anna, let's say you've done the intake, you've done the kickoff, the job is live, hiring process is now underway.
Mm-hmm.
What's the feedback loop, calibration? How often are you talking with hiring managers?
Let me interject there real quick, because there's one thing that I often see is the disconnect. Back to your point about salespeople in particular, is okay, so we have the job description, we have what success looks like and how we got there and so on and so forth, and then we jump immediately to the process versus, okay, how are we going to assess for those, and in what point in the process are we going to assess for those, and what is the most appropriate way to assess for those? Do you interject that piece of the process and work that with them? Do you share that with hiring managers? Or is that just something that over the years, just because of the types of roles you're hiring for, you have a pretty good rhythm in place already?
Yeah, great question. I do think that we have a pretty good rhythm in place already, because one thing that we're really lucky at here in Semperis is our retention, and how we have actually been working with the same hiring managers for quite some time now. So even new hiring managers that might come on board to certain teams, we are actually able to tell them, like, this is the interview process for that type of position. Like pre-sales engineers, for example, like we have a very specific process, and it has always worked really well for us. They have this demo, they have this assignment, like it just works amazingly. So we've already established that. But obviously, like back when we first started in 2022, working with these hiring teams, we had to start somewhere. So a lot of that is more us in recruiting being educated by the hiring manager on how they're going to assess the skill. We can make recommendations, right? But that's not our expertise. I wouldn't know how to check that, a software engineer is strong enough at C#. It's not my expertise. I look for the hiring managers to tell me how they plan to assess it.
Got it.
So we discuss it openly. We kind of develop that plan, and then we move forward with it. We're very honest, like I said in the beginning, we're very honest about what our part is in the search and what we're able to assess and kind of look for them. And then it's really up to them on the other items that they need to assess for.
Right.
So
Then you're
it's a partnership, but I do empower them to like decide how they want to assess that skill.
But yeah, it sounds like getting that up front, because then you can think about, okay, well, that throws a little wrench in the process that we had originally designed. And how do we help facilitate that for you so that it's timely, it's a good experience for the candidate? How does that fit into the other, steps? Is that a go, no go?
Right. That's the partnership piece. I've had people decide all of a sudden in the middle of a process, like, you know what, I really think I need an assignment now. And I'm like, well, but the first 10 candidates that you talked to, we didn't give them an assignment. So that's also like an unfair hiring practice. We can't just change it in the middle. Then everyone's going to have to get the assignment to make sure that it's a fair and equal hiring process, right? So that's where we come in, and we help them on like the compliance front and, how things really should be for the positive candidate experience. But ultimately, we're going to try our best to work in their desired method of assessment.
Yep.
Within reason.
Got it. That's great. Okay. All right. Back to Josh's question.
No, Gary, I love that you asked it because I was myself jumping straight to the process. So I'm glad we took a step back to think about how to assess candidates for the things that you're looking for. And I think, just going off your last point, Anna, one of the things that does come up mid-process are changes, wrenches in the system. Hiring manager thinks they need to do something else. How do you work with them to get really clear about like the problem they're actually trying to solve? Like a hiring manager says, we need an assignment now. It's like, okay, well, what's the underlying thing they're trying to get to that we're not solving for right now in our process? How do you help them figure that out?
Yeah, I think one thing that sometimes recruiting teams are scared of is pausing a search. It is hard, to do all that work up front, build a pipeline, talk to candidates and do all those things. And then suddenly the hiring manager changes their mind and you're not aligned and you're like, oh my God, what do I do with all these candidates that I just acquired, right? Please have no fear of pausing a search, is what I would say to recruiters. It's going to be more beneficial at the end. Like we said, do the work up front, but if you didn't, it's okay. You can, take the time and just do it in the middle, So I would say to have no fear to pause the search and just kind of start fresh with the hiring manager. And look, you already have that time or those candidates that you've built, right? That kind of candidate pipeline that you built up that you can bring into the conversation. These are the profiles that I've found so far. It seems like we're not hitting what you wanted. And you try to see, is it because of the way the hiring manager has been assessing those candidates, or was it the profile that you set in the beginning? And you kind of revisit and try to find the pain points together. What I don't like is when a recruiting team tries to either put all the accountability or blame, I hate that word, but blame on the hiring manager's lack of decision or lack of direction, right? Because it is a two-way street. Take accountability for what area of the process you may have, had be weaker, that you even got to that point. And again, like I said, hold yourself accountable, pause and just start over again. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when you said that, the salesperson in me is reminded of, the management of a deal through a pipeline.
Yes.
It just because if the buyer got to no decision or paused or for whatever reason, I'm let's not blame entirely the buyer. Did we help facilitate that process? So if you think about kind of deal management, it's really, there's probably signals that you can see that we probably haven't defined this role right, or maybe things have shifted in the department, or things are starting to go off the rails here. Let's not wait till the end to pause that, but be able to step in proactively.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think, look, it's really hard, like you said, to pause a search and reset and think about where do we go from here? Because again, the hiring manager is anxious. They want to get this person on their team. The team needs the person. Maybe the team's feeling burnout because they don't have this person on the team. There's all these factors at play, but the reality is that the hiring process isn't concrete, right? It's important to be flexible and adapt based on what you're seeing in the market and based on what's flowing through the process. Pouring concrete is hiring the wrong person. Right? Obviously, it's a reversible decision, but nobody wants to go down that path. It's really, really costly for the organization. So it's better to reset and level on what do we actually need versus just continue down the path because we're getting anxious about the fact that we haven't hired anybody yet.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point that you make. So what are the checkpoints that you have in place to make sure that you have the proper collaboration so you can identify where maybe change is needed earlier, sooner than later?
Yeah. So I think for me, sometimes I do get a little bit far from the search unless it's a search that I'm doing myself. And so I make sure that I'm really communicating with my team on a weekly basis. We have weekly team meetings and then weekly one-on-ones where I'm really getting, updates on kind of how things are going. I also can, see the activity that's happening because I see how busy they are, right? And all the interviews that are happening. So I'm trying to keep a pulse throughout the search on if the hiring managers are having a lot of interviews, right? So are you having a lot of candidates to set up with the hiring managers, or are we stuck in that, front end or in that top of funnel for a little bit too long? And when we do get stuck in top of funnel for a little bit too long and the hiring managers aren't, those steps aren't getting to, that's where you kind of know, in your checkpoint, that's a really key checkpoint. If they're not passing the recruiter step, we're obviously not looking for the right thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the first checkpoints. And then again, pass-through rates, right, are super important. So when they do get to the next professional interview, are they not passing the first step, right? So I think pass-through rates is a really great data point that sometimes people don't always look at, but I would say like that's my biggest checkpoint is like, is there like activity?
Mm-hmm. I love that you brought it back to numbers. Obviously, you're in a leadership position, so you're overseeing, your team that's looking across all these different roles. So you have to look for the indicators that things are going well or things are off the track. And so you mentioned number of interviews. I mean, just as an early indicator that things are happening, we're moving people through the process, but also pass-through rate, not only at the recruiter screen, but also I imagine at the hiring manager interview as well, because it's one thing for them to have a lot of interviews, but if they're giving you 1 stars in all the interviews they're having, nobody's happy, and we have motion without progress.
Yep, exactly.
And so, sorry, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so we go through that, and Josh, jump in if you're going to head in the same direction. But you ever run into a point where you go through all of those things, you have a good process, you've been really good on your intake process, you understand the job requirements, how you're going to assess, you get to the very end and you feel like, we've got a really good fit here. And then you get I want to see 3 more candidates.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that I don't have that problem. I don't want to jinx myself. Like I need to knock on something.
Sorry if we just did that to you.
I don't want to put that into the universe, guys. So I'm very lucky that here at Semperis, like we don't always have that problem. And one of the reasons is because exactly of what we're talking about here today, right? So my recruiting team has done a really good job of gaining the trust of the hiring managers and building that relationship that we are very focused on quality over quantity. And so typically when they get to that last step, they've been communicating the whole entire time. And if they would have wanted more candidates, they would have told us sooner in the process. Does that make sense? So like, I don't think a hiring manager, we're not typically getting there. It's happened like 1 or 2 times. But typically you would know already at like maybe step 2 or something. You wouldn't get all the way to the final interview with someone unless that department head really like wanted to hire that person.
Yeah. Yeah. It just reinforces the importance of that intake process and just making that such a foundation so that you don't inadvertently end up in those positions down the road. And now you've burned a lot of candidates, a lot of time and energy for one, but then obviously a lot of candidates who have been through the process as well. So
I've heard those stories. I really feel for the recruiting teams that have managers that do that. But I think that even in that case, you could have set that up front, right? So I've even had managers where we discuss like, okay, we're going to do the first steps, the recruiter, myself, let's say, and you, like, we're going to do the first steps and then let's narrow it down together, just you and I, to 3 people. And those are the 3 people that are going to move to RVP, right? So that like when we even get to the final stage, it's the people we want to hire. So if you set that up front, maybe at these other companies, that it's someone that wants, tons of candidates and they get FOMO and stuff like that, then you probably upfront, you should know you're going to need to bring that hiring manager more volume.
Yep. Patrick brought up a really good example or situation here, and that is a discrepancy in expected compensation. So talk through a little bit. There's a lot, everybody's got a perspective and opinion on what we should do or not do inside of a hiring process around compensation. But, to avoid those situations where you get to the 11th hour and there's just a wildly diverging situation, whether it's between the hiring manager and the candidate, between you and the candidate, but how do you navigate that to make sure that everybody's on the same plane as you progress through the process?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a broken record, but like compensation has to be talked about early in the beginning of the process. And the recruiters need to be asking the candidates their expectations and being clear with them about the budget for the role. It's also been very rare for us that we're getting to the final stage and it's like a complete shock. The only time that I have seen that happen was in situations where maybe the candidate kind of came in thinking one thing or wanting one thing, and then potentially throughout the interview process, maybe they got a raise where they were currently working. And so now they like want more, or throughout the interview process, they learned more about the role and they feel that it was more responsibilities than they originally, had told me their salary expectations for. And so they're kind of like, well, if you want me to go to the office or you want me to do X, Y, Z, I'll expect it to be, $10,000 more or whatever. In all of the cases, it has been, in my opinion, very fair when the situation has happened. But you should always be talking about compensation early. Nobody wants to waste their time.
Right.
Yep. And you need to talk about that with hiring managers. That's where it starts, right? Hiring manager comes to you with all these things they want. And you need to use the resources you have available to you to figure out if what they're looking for is actually possible, given the budget that you actually have for this position. And if there's a misalignment there, we have to correct that there. That's the first step.
They describe the candidate and you're going through it and you're like, yeah, your budget's 120 and you just described a $300,000 candidate.
Yeah, you just described like a principal software engineer in San Francisco. Like, good luck.
Right.
Yeah. We've found success from a comp standpoint of actually putting it on the application, of like giving a very tight range of what it is and asking on the application if it's aligned with their expectations. 'Cause that's a good way, just like before they even take an intro call with somebody on the team, it's a good way to set expectations. You could put in the job description, and you should, of course, but if it's at the bottom or mixed in with all the other content, who knows if they're going to see it. So the more places you can put this information, help candidates make decision, ultimately is going to save you and also your hiring managers, who you're trying to make sure you set up with quality interviews. It's going to save them a lot of time as well.
Better experience for the candidate too. Yep.
For sure. And there's a lot of companies who are slow to the salary transparency, kind of circus right now. But if you do it in your sourcing, like you can, if you're not the type of company that has it in all of your posts, like I'll be honest, we don't have it in every single job posting if it's not a state that requires it. But you can put it in your sourcing notes. You can talk about all the other benefits and perks that you give. And you should talk about it in that recruiter call. Maybe then they're wasting only 30 minutes of their time to have a screening with you, right? To like have the discussion rather than putting them through the whole interview process. So there's ways around it if you are not at a company that is being fully salary transparent at the moment.
Yeah. And that's a good point too, not to deviate too much, but candidates are coming in from all these different channels where you might be sourcing them from LinkedIn and they didn't go through your application. Like I talked about, we have the questionnaire application, but if they're a referral or a recruiter source them, they don't go through that process. So we need to make sure we have those checks along the way, so candidates are all getting the same information so they make a good decision. And ultimately, you're setting up hiring managers where it's a good investment of their time, where that person actually has an opportunity to become a member of their team realistically.
The we asked the question earlier, it seems like the perfect place for it is the difficult hiring manager. So we're in the middle of the process, and probably a lot of times it's not out of obstinance, it's just the tyranny of the now. Like something comes up and they're really busy and you've had conversations about getting involved, but when you run into these situations where it's misaligned expectations or inability to deliver or communication issues or whatever, how have you typically found the best ways to confront that or attack that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have all, have plenty of stories about difficult hiring managers or difficult searches that we've gone through. And I really think that most of those situations can be solved by hopping on a video chat or like getting on the phone call, right? So often, and I've coached my team in this too, that I feel really strongly that a text message, a Teams or Slack or whatever, like in email, anything that's like in writing like that, where the tone can be misconstrued, or you might not be getting all the context that a person is really trying to express to you. If that exchange is going on for more than 2 or 3 times, it's time to stop typing, right? and to get on the phone. So that's my first advice in general, like to everybody, is to like, it's time to stop typing. It's time to get on the phone, reconnect, as people, and talk about like what's going on and what you think the pain points are. Now, if you're going to jump on the call, be ready and have your bullet points of like why you're taking this call and what you need to talk about, what you feel is going wrong, and hold yourself accountable too. So don't just get on the call because you're trying to tell the hiring manager how difficult they are, right? So you're trying to tell the hiring manager what you see isn't working. And if there's something going on, like some of it could be your part too, right? So as a recruiter, like we need to make sure that we're not, like I said before, just blaming the hiring manager. Oh, they never give me time. They are looking for a unicorn in something that doesn't exist. Like it's all their fault. It's never all their fault. There's always something that we could be doing to get it back on track.
It's a really good call out.
Yeah. So really be thoughtful about that. And then if you're going to get on that call, be thoughtful about what you're about to say, right? Because you can either help the relationship or hurt it even more. With that phone call. So that's really important. And I think the other thing to get it back on track is to have some data behind it. Be really honest with the hiring manager. This is how these last few weeks have been going. This is what I'm seeing. Use names, use whatever, however you're referring to candidates. We interviewed, X person in this place. You gave them a 2, I gave them a 5. How could that be? And like have the conversation about it and get it back on track. But hopefully that answers your question. I really think it's all about just like that communication again, like we talked about.
Yeah,
collaboration.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. But I think this idea, the way you talked about A, having that conversation, but B, being prepared, is coming to it, seeking to understand. The reality is you only have one perspective. There's two sides to every board. There's another quote for you, Josh. And the idea, I think, coming there with humility, which is this isn't working, but here's my understanding of what's happened to date. Like, here's what I know. I want to understand what you see and what's different here. And then together we can figure out how to solve this. Obviously you're in a much better spot that way versus like, this isn't working and you're the problem.
Yes. And sometimes the hiring managers will have a lot to tell you, right? Because we can be really honest with ourselves too, as recruiters. Like, we might be very familiar with the market and what's happening and everything, but a lot of these hiring managers, many of the ones that I speak to as well, are maybe Microsoft MVPs. They're in these blogs, they're in these groups, they're in Discord, right? And they also have a really good pulse on the market. And they might have input, or opinions about why the search is not working that we don't even know about, because we're not in the, engineering group or the Active Directory expert group and seeing what everyone's chatting about.
Yep. I want to pull up this question here. I think it's getting pulled up. Did you guys see it?
The show?
I don't see anything yet.
Okay. Well, there's a question
Okay.
from Priya. She asked, how would you approach, there we go. How would you approach the situation if it is taking longer to hire the right talent and the hiring manager is anxious about how long it's taking?
Yeah. It's amazing, because I have actually two situations right now that I will tell you about, the real life opportunities and situations that are happening right now for my team. So one is a senior security software engineer that's been really hard to find. It's a very, very specific kind of niche skill set. It's a new project, things like that, right? But the recruiter and the hiring manager that are working on it have worked together for such a long time now that they just know. Like, the hiring manager has literally said to me, well, if she can't find it, I don't know who can, right? That's how much faith he has in her. And that just shows how important that relationship is. He really trusts her work and that she's trying so hard. And so they're having interviews that trickle in, right? So like, maybe it's once a week, maybe it's every other week or something. She's finding like the gem of the candidate that fits it, and he's being super patient. Then you have the flip side of things. This is for, a totally different kind of team and role. And you have the hiring manager who's like panicking, and you get the emails late at night, and they're sending you like the LinkedIn profiles of like 20 people, because they're like, look, all these profiles are great. Can you contact all of them? And they're just like going off the rails. I have that going on right now too, right? Because you have to understand, like, they're really stressed. Like, maybe their team is really under, resourced right now, and they're struggling, and they're trying to, help their team feel calm, and they really need this person and stuff. So it's, again, like, letting them have that, let them experience it. It's similar to, I'm a mom, right? So like, it's similar to letting your kid like feel their feelings. Let them have that, like, let them have that stress, right? And have that communication, that open line of communication for you, because when they go quiet is when you should be worried, right? If they're not sharing those concerns with you, you haven't built that connection. You haven't. So let them feel those feelings and share those things with you, and then reassure them with the data. Come back to them with what you are doing. This is what your sourcing looks like. This is what your in-mail response percentage is. This is what I'm seeing in the market and why I think it's taking a long time. Why do you think it's taking a long time, right? And then you have that conversation about it, and you discuss what you can adjust. So with the team that I have that happening with right now, they did get on a call, they talked about it, and it was not for lack of activity at all. Like, there was a pipeline. You just weren't finding what they wanted. Like, it just, there's this like lack of that person like in the market right now in terms of what they're finding. They changed the job description, up. They kind of adjusted all the requirements that they wanted to list. They lowered the years of experience. They're starting to look in different countries. So I do think, I'm confident that we're now going to find it. But that was the perfect situation of, I see that you're stressed. I'm going to let you have, those feelings. And I'm going to tell you, I think that we need to pause and let's start fresh, so that I can, make you feel 100% confident that we're all on the same page.
Yeah. I can appreciate your perspective there. I really like it, actually, which is, a lot of times people have a noisy hiring manager, and it's like, they're being so annoying. They're constantly pinging me. But it's really a good problem to have, because that means you have somebody that cares and they want to find the right person, and they're, active in wanting to do that. And so you have to harness that energy for good. And that's where, to your point, it's like, all right, I can, I'm going to let you feel what you're going to feel, but now let's work together and figure out what do we need to do to find this person for you, so you can divert that energy into something that's productive for the hiring team.
Exactly. Don't forget the other side of that could be that person, if you haven't built up that trust where they're sharing their frustration with you, they're going to share their frustration with someone else. And it could be your CEO, it could be your head of TA, it could be your VP of HR, right? Like, you don't want that to happen. We're all adults here. You want the conversation to be directly with you. So always just make sure that you're giving them that space to be anxious if they have to.
Priya, maybe you can jump in the chat, and because there is a lot of nuance that you started to hit on, Anna, which I thought was really helpful, which is, a situation that is taking, I'll put it up here again, situation that is taking longer to hire the right talent, and hiring managers anxious about it. And you started to hit on those things. Well, why is it taking longer? Do we have the wrong expectations going in? Is it now we're realizing that the market has shifted? Maybe our comp is off. Maybe the job description relative to that is wrong. Maybe there's other aspects of the job. So I think it's hard to solve that anxiousness if you don't break it down to what can we actually do something about. And to me, it all comes back to that very beginning at the intake process, is you set that strong foundation, and now you've got all the variables that you have to work with, that if things, and when they, not if, but when they start going differently than everybody planned, like how do you adapt to that? So Priya, hopefully that was helpful. And if you got any questions, please jump in there.
One thing, I know we've only got a couple of minutes left here on time. So let's kind of go to the end of the process now. So you've gone through the process with the hiring manager. We just talked about a question where the hiring manager gets anxious because we're not finding the person they're looking for. Now let's explore the flip side. You're at the end of the process. The TA team, the recruiter, is getting anxious because the hiring manager isn't making a decision, or they're taking too long to make that decision, or they're waffling back and forth, or they're having FOMO and want to see more candidates. How do you help coach them through that at the end of the process, so you don't lose somebody that you're about to potentially make an offer to because you're just taking too long to get back to them?
Yeah, so the debrief conversation is super important at that time, right? Because sometimes certain hiring managers, they're almost like scared to make the decision. So if you get on the debrief call and you maybe involve everybody that's been in the interview process, so let's say it's like the direct hiring manager and a team lead and one other person, right? So you get all of you guys together on the call, and the TA's role in that conversation is almost like a mediator. So you're not really giving your opinion. You're allowing the others kind of discuss their view and feedback and evaluations of each candidate, so that the hiring manager can listen and hear. And sometimes it'll really make them a lot more confident about making their decision. Positive to hire the candidate, or negative to decline the candidate, right? Either way, hearing others' opinions or feedback about a person can really help that hiring manager decide and feel more confident in their decision. And so as TA, again, like I said, you're kind of the mediator. You're reflecting back what they're saying, and you're listening, and you're saying, okay, I heard you say that you felt that person was very strong, but I heard Gary say that he felt like this person had a weak spot here. What do you think about that? Tell me more, right? Very open-ended, letting them come to the decision.
Love it. All right, 1 minute left. I've got the big loaded question for you.
Okay.
For everybody that's listening and that wants to make an impact on the collaboration with their hiring managers, we've talked about a lot of different ideas. What do you think is like low-hanging fruit? What can people walk away from right now and just immediately thrust themselves into to start driving better relationships with their hiring managers?
Yeah, I would say the immediate and easiest thing is to take all those intake questions and kind of all those ideas you have in your head and allow your hiring managers to be prepared coming in. Make sure you're helping them to set the tone. Put it into like a little one-pager PDF or document, attach it to the invites that you send them, or shoot a little email over to some of the hiring managers and just say like, hey, these are some of the things I'm going to ask you to be ready for when we kick off the search. And hopefully you're just going to set the tone for some of the people.
Awesome.
Yes. And to that point, we actually have put together and continue to build out a set of resources that we call higher education. So we got a little play on words. Well done, team. I'll put a link to that in the chat, and we'll also include it in the recording as we send it out. But that should be really helpful. But Anna, we are so thankful that you spent time with us. Thanks. We told you from the beginning, like whatever outline we have, we're just going to riff on it. We did. So
I could talk about this all day. I really loved it. Thank you so much, guys.
You rocked it. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So stick around for a minute, but we'll, for the rest of everybody here, really appreciate you joining us, taking time out of your day. Until our next episode of Let's Talk Hiring, we'll see you then. Thank you.
See ya.